Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound. It's a show that aims to provide hope and avenue for healing, and one that will help you understand and then live the great mercy of God. With me today, I have a beautiful lady. She's got an incredible story. She's written several books on the faith. She's had a interesting faith walk in her own sense. But today we're going to kind of focus more on her book of Men and Mary, How 6 Men Won the Greatest Battle of Their Lives. It's available at queenofpeacemedia.com. And I love this book because it provides some just miraculous stories that I think just lift us all up and help us realize in a deeper way, God is alive. The Blessed Mother's out there. They're trying to call everybody back, and we just have to listen. Like the scripture says, for those who have ears, listen. And so Christine's going to share some of her thoughts on the book, her life, and more today. Just a little bit about Christine. She's a Catholic speaker, as I mentioned, the author of numerous books, formerly a ballet dancer with the San Francisco Ballet Company, and she, in an earlier time, was an avowed Christian, anti-Christian atheist. She became a believer after miraculous healing, which we hope to talk about as well. She's worked as a hospital grief counselor and as a post-abortion healing director. She has a beautiful website at Christine, Christine, Watkins, Watkins.com. And again, we're going to be talking about her book of Men and Mary, How 6 Men Won the Greatest Battle of Their Lives. Christine, give us a little story about yourself, if you would, growing up, and at what point in your life did you say, hey, I'm an atheist?
Well, I was raised in a family that told me there was no God, so I accepted that as truth. And my dear parents would make fun of Christianity, so I thought that that was the thing to do. It's the opiate of the masses.
Yeah.
And I even remember a high school acquaintance converting to Christianity after my friend broke up with him. And I thought, well, of course, you're lonely, you're sad, you're deranged. I was so judgmental. You're seeking fairyland to make everything better. And and my dad on Easter sometimes would wear one of those decal Jesus shirts that glimmers. And that was the big joke, right? Jesus was a joke. And so Christianity was off the table. I didn't even know that there were different denominations. I didn't know that Easter was a religious holiday. So bunnies, eggs, that's all I knew. And if we go into any store around, like the time that this is being filmed is right before Easter, are we going to see anything about the resurrection? We're not. He's gone. He's been wiped out of Easter in society. So I didn't know till I was 16 that Easter was a religious holiday, for instance. So that's my upbringing. So I think I know everything, and one thing I know for sure is I'm never going to become a Christian. That's the most embarrassing, humiliating thing I could ever do with my life. So that's my attitude. But I end up, I have another God, because we all have a God-shaped hole. If it's not filled with the real God, it's going to be filled with something else. And for me, that was ballet. That was my career. I practiced it diligently for years. I started dancing with the San Francisco Ballet Company, loved everything about it. Thought I would do it, until my body gave out. Well, my body gave out a lot sooner than I'd planned. I was very young. I was in my teens, and I had foot injuries and 3 foot operations. I couldn't restore my feet, and I ended up losing my career in the only God I ever knew. And I grew depressed, and I lost hope, and I looked for I looked for comfort in my sadness in intimate relationships. And I fell deeper and deeper into serious sin. And I felt temporarily filled with some kind of life when I was in a relationship. But when that relationship inevitably failed, I was left with this larger, deep, lonely hole inside of me. And I was always looking outside myself for someone or something to bring me comfort, to bring me peace. But that peace was so elusive because sin never brings peace. And I was looking into the New Age movement for answers. So I was open to spirituality. I was just not open to the real God. So in a sense, I wasn't an avowed atheist. I was an avowed non-Christian. So I was open to, well, maybe a guru could say something to help me. Maybe I was a princess in my past life, because when you do these past life things in the New Age movement, you're always a princess. You're never the garbage man, right? And so I was searching and searching and searching. And one summer, I ended up very, very sick. It turns out I had cervical cancer and I had little time left to live. My hair was falling out. I was bleeding internally and I couldn't keep food down. And I was so, so tired. I would try to cross the street and wouldn't be able to get there. But worse than the suffering in my body, I was so, so, so very sick inside my soul. At times I would just cry out in guttural despair, and then I would have these tears flooding me, but they wouldn't stop, and they weren't healing tears. They were just despairing tears. And I was with a friend. I didn't know he was Catholic one day, and he was trying to help me. He didn't know what to do. And he was praying for me. I didn't know what prayer was. And he was praying for me, and I just was not well. And I didn't even know he was praying. And I felt this beautiful presence around me and within me, passing through me. It's almost like my soul was expanding to take up the whole room. And I felt no pain in my body all of a sudden, no agony in my mind. And I heard a loud pop inside my body. And I turned to my friend and I said, Joseph, well, what was that? What was that beautiful feeling just now? What just happened to me? And he said, Christine, just now Mother Mary came. She looked down from heaven upon you, took pity on you, and asked her son to save you. And it turns out that the cancer was gone. It was decimated in that one moment. And Mother Mary had knocked on Jesus's door, asked her son, will you save her? And he said yes. And so that was the beginning of everything.
Were you at that time?
What's that?
How old were you at that
I
time?
was about 26.
Wow, very young for that type of serious medical problems.
But old enough to have done a lot of damage to myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that started like the first day of the rest of your life, in a way.
Yes, that's exactly right. And as the Bible says, sometimes we have an illness not because of something we've done. It's just there to glorify God, like the man born blind. As Jesus said, this is to show God's glory. But in my case, it was cervical cancer, and I caused my sins caused my own demise. So
How did you
I'm
meet your
guilty.
husband?
What's that?
How did you meet your husband?
We were in San Francisco, both going to the same church, and he was the housemate of a friend of mine and had another girlfriend. And I thought that she's not the right person for him. Turns out I was right, but didn't know it.
Yeah, that's cute. That's cute. Well, you've written other books. One on the Illumination. Uh, some really interesting stuff. You really have grown attached to Mother Mary, haven't you?
Well, yes, a lot of my books involve Mother Mary, and that was not a planned decision. It turns out that's her. I never really wanted to write a book, number one. And so these books keep coming through, and I do them out of obedience, never planned to be a writer. Some of them become bestsellers, and they usually have her imprint or her mark on them. And when she first asked Jesus to save me, after that, she spoke to me and asked me to pray the rosary, and I didn't pray it for like 7 years. I thought it was boring. So she has really had her, she has decided that I would work for her, even when I was a mess, when I was a sinful mess. Um, yeah, so here's the part where I cry. So, here I am. How can I not work for her?
Right. What book are you working on now?
I have just finished a book. I mean, there she is again. The Miraculous Medal, Pendant of Power. And so God took me in an unexpected direction. I'm working on a book that is Heaven's Pharmacy, reclaiming God's herbal healing. And so I didn't plan on writing about that, but it turns out that Catholicism has a long history of herbal remedies that heal. Even weeds you walk by on the sidewalk can cure some cancers, but then we go into the hospital not knowing we just trampled over our healing. And I found that fascinating, especially since I've had some things that allopathic medicine, which is also good, does some things very well, did not heal me of, but just eating some plants, some ugly weeds did. And so monks, they used to in Europe have their herbal gardens. That was part of what they did, and we've lost that history. And I found it fascinating. So that's the next book coming up.
Good for you. Let's talk a little bit about the book here and share with us as much as you want or can on a couple of the gentlemen. First is Father Michael Lightner. Um, I read his story and then I read it again last night. My wife and I, we had 40 hours adoration going on. I took your book and read his story during adoration again. And it's not like he was a big guy and football player and loved to push the envelope a lot and speed and things. Can you just share with us about him and
So Father Michael Leitner, he's the first person whose story is in the Book of Men and Mary. And he started off, was raised in a Catholic family. I thought the rosary was boring too, but so boring that he would fall asleep and wanted nothing to do with it because his Catholicism was pushed on him. So he blamed the fact that it was pushed on him to his reticence. And once he got off to college, he was free. He said, well, this religion is mine to choose or not. And he chose not. And his love of sports, football in particular, started with a dream he had when he was about 8 years old, where he was experiencing play by play all the moves of a certain pro football game. And he woke up from that dream saying, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be a pro football player. So he pursues that dream in college. He ends up starting to get really involved in marijuana. He's a huge, massive guy. At age 14, he was 6'4". I just think about that for a while. He was 280 some pounds
yeah,
at
yeah.
age 14. So scouts were looking at him, salivating for a long time. So he ends up almost getting into the big leagues in college, and he's very excited about it. But one summer, home from Christmas, while he's running up and down the fields during his college days, his mother's running back and forth to the pilgrimage site of Medjugorje in Bosnia-Herzegovina and bringing back all these scapulars and constantly talking about the Blessed Mother. And everyone thinks she's cuckoo, and they don't even know how to pronounce Medjugorje. They keep calling it Medjugorje. And so they don't care at all. The whole family of 10 children thinks she's nuts. And he's taken a nap, and his 3-year-old nephew finds a little bag under his bed and says, "What's this?" Well, it turns out that he wakes up from his nap to see his mother crying above him with the cellophane bag full of marijuana. And his sister, who works as a substance abuse counselor at the VA, saying, "Busted. Now you have to go to Medjugorje. Now you have to go to Medjugorje." And his mother says, that's a good idea. So she was a strong-willed woman. He's a strong-willed son. She wins that argument. He goes to Medjugorje and has an explosive, absolutely explosive conversion there of heart. And do you want me to tell you some of the parts of that, or
Keep
there's
going.
so
Yeah.
much
I
to
think the
it?
people want to hear the story. It's
The
incredible.
story. So he he's there for 7 days and he's walking towards St. James Church. His mother convinces him. She said, if you do anything here, go to confession. If not, for God, for me. So he agrees to that. And he's walking towards St. James Church and he said, look, God, I don't know if you're real or not, but you got 7 days to prove yourself to me. Otherwise, I'm just going to, believe that you're the product of 12 men who were drunk and fooling the world. And so he goes to confession, and he's a massive guy. And by this point, he's 325 pounds, 6'5", bench press is 400. Those numbers mean nothing to me because I don't exercise. What that means.
Big
But
guy, let's put it that way.
yeah, thank you for clarifying. And so he's in St. James, and he somehow fits his big body into a small confessional room, and he goes to town. He kind of takes it, I think, as a personal dare to. He said he writes in the story. Well, he didn't write, I wrote it, but he told the story to me. Kind of wants the little old man priest behind the screen. He wants his ears to bleed. So he lays it all out. He's confessing everything, and he thinks that the priest is going to be shocked. Well, the priest probably has heard it all. He broke every single commandment, and starts to give him his penance, his prayer of absolution. As he's saying the prayer of absolution for the forgiveness of his sins, Father Lightner is on his knees in the confessional, and suddenly a force, his feet are tucked underneath him, his upper body is thrust, and his head hits the back of the confessional, and he's immobilized. This big man can't move a single muscle. And at the same time, he feels physically a force like a spear stab straight into his heart, and he screamed in agony. It was such a visceral pain. And he screamed and felt that as this sword was pulled out of his heart, all of his sins were pulled out at the same time. And then his body was released from this stranglehold. And he said, oh my God, you are real. You're real. He goes into the church and he's in a daze, and he's barely paying attention to the mass that has begun. He kind of wakes up to the reality that he's in a mass when he sees Father Stan Fortuna at the podium giving the homily. And he says to himself, well, let me listen to what he has to say. And right when he says that, he's shot up into ecstasy. And he said he wasn't sure if he didn't want to open his eyes because he actually wasn't sure if he was on the ceiling or not. And he said that the feeling of ecstasy, the intense joy, pleasure, was beyond any of the physical pleasures he'd ever touched. He said it was 1,000,000 times greater than winning the greatest football game ever, than his sexual exploits, than anything he'd ever touched. And then he left the church, and there's many funny scenes in this story, and there's many funny scenes in Of Men and Mary. The men who tell their stories, by and large, have a good sense of humor, so they put their quirks in the stories, which I really enjoy. And so he walks out of the church, and he must have been glowing because a woman comes up to him immediately and says, will you pray over me? And he's thinking, I don't know. And he seen people do it before, so he goes like this and prays over her. Well, she falls she's slain in the spirit.
Hmm.
She completely goes down, and he's terrified, like he's been caught in the act of a crime, and he runs away. So that's the beginning. And he ends up in what's called Siroki Briege. And Father Yozo Zofko is a very famous priest from Medjugorje who was there at the beginning of the apparitions and didn't believe. He didn't believe at all. He wondered why all these people weren't in his parish and were up on Apparition Hill chasing a ghost. And he wanted them in front of the Eucharist. He's a very solid Orthodox priest. He didn't get it. And one day he was praying, saying, "Tell me if this is real, Mary. I don't understand what's going on." And he heard a woman's voice speak to him in audible locution, said, "Go now and protect the children." So he obeyed the voice. He got up from his pew, went to the side door of the church and opened it. And immediately at that moment, the children, all 6 visionaries of Medjugorje, ran into the church, escaping the communists who were after them. They were greatly persecuted by the communists at that time. And that was the beginning of him realizing, wait a minute, this is Mary. And so Father Yozo would see pilgrims in a nearby church where pilgrims would take a bus ride to this Siroki Briege, where many Franciscans were martyred. There's a great history there. And he would pray over some of the priests, who would in turn pray over the pilgrims who came, who in turn would receive many healings. And so Michael Lightner was there in Medjugorje. And he, being a big guy, he was attracted to this little tiny Franciscan priest who reminded him of Padre Pio, who seemed very holy. And every time this priest would touch someone, they'd fall, and they'd be slain in the spirit. And he thought, well, I should help him out. I can catch all these people. So he's catching all these people going down and exhausted by this. And so he needs to rest. And he was thankful that the little priest sits down and focuses on this one lady whose spinal cord was severed, who then developed meningitis, whose bottom half of her body was completely atrophied. There's no way this woman would ever walk again. It was medically impossible. And the priest was taking all this time, blessing her arms, her shoulders, her legs, her spine. And Michael Leitner's getting really tired of this. He's like, the woman's not going to walk. Can we just give this up? But for some reason, he felt God not letting him leave this scene. He would want to get distracted, and God would pull him back. No, stay with this woman. And then he got upset with God, which he often did, and said, What, you want me to pray for her? What do you want? And silence. He's like, okay, I'll pray for her. And he said, well, we'll make her walk, he said to God. And then God spoke to him audibly in a locution and said, Michael, if I get her up and make her walk, will you enter the seminary? And he said, absolutely not. So another 20 minutes go by, and it's a torturous 20 minutes. He's wrestling with what God said, and he feels like he can't leave the scene. And he says, oh, okay. But he changes the game a little bit. He says, if you get her up and you make her walk all the way around Siroki Brie's church, then I'll enter the seminary. 2 seconds later, without being told, without being pushed, nothing, she just gets up. Stands up, which is an impossibility. She walks to the back of her wheelchair and she starts to push it all around the church. And he's saying, no. And he starts saying, somebody stop her. Stop this woman. And then he changes the deal again. And he says, okay, Lord, if she doesn't step on this certain square tile in front of the tabernacle, I'm not entering the seminary. So he watches, and she put. She takes her wheelchair and she stops on that very tile in front of the tabernacle and sits down. All these expletives come out of his mouth, and it needed several more Medjugorje trips, a few more years for him to let go of this dream he had of being a football player. It was all he'd ever wanted to do. And so how did God handle that? in college one night, by this time he's praying the rosary. They have 400 people over at his house for a party, an after game party. And during the game, Father Mike, I'm sorry, I shouldn't spill the beans. Michael Lightner had an experience that freaked him out because he, during this game, knew every play that was going to happen. He knew that they were going to win. He knew by how many points they were going to win. He knew how many yards they were going to go forward. He knew everything in advance as he was living it. And he sat down in the locker room after the game, put a towel over his head and started to cry and thinks, I've taken too many drugs. I've lost it. My mind is no longer mine. He was very scared. And so that night there's the big party. He's done at midnight. He goes, locks himself in his room and prays his rosary. He's no longer the man he was after that first Medjugorje trip. And he sits down and he passes out. Well, he has a dream. And in the dream, he's doing the same football plays that just happened. And he's going through the whole thing again. But he's realizing that when he was a kid, he thought it was a pro football stadium. But he's realizing that he's reliving the game that he just played and that he saw as a child. But the colors of the teams were the same colors as the pro football teams that he thought of as a child, but they're actually the same teams as the college game that he just played. So he's like, oh, that dream as a child just came true. I just lived it and I'd seen it in advance. And the Lord, I want to get the words right because it's so amazing because he has God say to him, this was your dream. It has been fulfilled. Now mine, priesthood. And that was it. He's joyfully entered the priesthood finally. It took him a while, several more confirmations, but now he can't imagine doing anything else. And he's so happy that God broke him away from football because he said, ultimately, yes, it was a dream. It was a worldly dream, though. And it was a distraction. It was a distraction from seeking the true God.
While you were speaking, I was thinking of even my own life, and perhaps you can relate how we think we've got life all figured out. And my life is totally different than what I ever would imagine when I was in my 20s or early 30s. And it's so much better because God is an integral part of it. And I think you can relate to that as well.
Yeah, well, I think when I said, if there's anything I'll never be, it's a Christian or a Catholic. That was a vow. So if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, right?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And I didn't want to be an author or speaker ever. So he has me out there speaking too and writing. And I've never written a journal or written anything just to write it because I don't like to write. And I didn't want to do speech class. So there was a chance to take a class other than speech. You had to take 3 of them though. You could go through 3 semesters of something else or 1 semester of speech. It was a no-brainer. I wasn't going to do a speech class. I wasn't going to write and I wasn't going to speak.
Yeah, so he uses you in spite of ourselves. It's interesting. Yeah. Now, Father Lightner knew Rick Wendell, and we get into the next story in your book, which to me, I've seen his witness on YouTube, and when I saw that he was in your book, I said, "Oh, we got to talk about Father Rick because this is a great story as well." I mean, this to me just like gets me on fire because it's like, people, don't tell me there's no God. Don't tell me God doesn't exist. Don't tell me the Blessed Mother doesn't love us and is trying to bring us all to Jesus. Share with us Father Rick's story, if you would.
So Father Rick, he's become a friend. So that was one of the first videos I did and posted on the Queen of Peace Media YouTube channel, and it's got, I don't know, over 1 million. It really struck a chord with people, in part because he met God and he died. So he literally died. So he's a womanizer. He is into money, and he wants to go as fast and hard and dangerous as he can. So by the time he's 20, he's had several broken bones. He's been in the hospital umpteen times, almost died several times. So a thrill seeker who took it to the limit and would hurt himself. And he said his mother was just trying to keep him alive. That was her job, like to have Rick not kill himself. And so he ends up, he gets into drugs. He has several women. He says he went to 4 proms with 4 different girls graduating from high school. Who does that, he says. And he's also in an upcoming movie called The Great Warning, which is about the illumination of conscience. And he had one, and I'll get to that in a sec. And he does a great job in the movie, The Great Warning. He does a great job. And so he's the second person in the book of Men and Mary, how 6 men won the greatest battle of their lives. And you have to read it, is all I can say, but I'll give you snippets. So he ends up in the hospital because one of the many accidents he has, a nail stabs his cheek when he's pounding on it, trying to do some construction work. He owns this construction company. By this time, he's engaged to be married. And he has an anaphylactic reaction to this anesthesia for the stitches. And he literally, his mom goes into the grocery store after she picks him up from the stitches at the hospital, and he follows her to find her in the grocery store because his heart rate's up and he's not feeling well. And he collapses right there inside the market. And this is where it all begins, because they're trying to revive him and they can't get his heart going again. And he ends up in an ambulance, and he is coding. He literally dies in the ambulance. And he remembers he without any feeling, he's out of his body. He sees people frantic. He sees people doing chest compressions on his body. And he passes through the scene into complete darkness. And from there, he says, I don't know if the light met me or I met the light, but suddenly I was in this incredibly magnificent, all-loving presence of God. And he says there's complete and utter love, complete, and everything is fulfilled within your every sense, your every desire, completely satiated. And he didn't want to be anywhere else. He was just in God and in love. And ever since that moment in his life, he says, I don't believe God exists. I know he exists. And he understood, he had infused knowledge at the same time that God was the I am. He understood the Alpha and the Omega. He understood that we're in time, but God is outside of time. He understood that God is everything. It was all just crystal clear to him. Things that people wrestle with and grapple with and never come to faith, he knew. And so after that, he comes, he's in the presence of God, but meanwhile, his body literally dies. He's cold to the touch. He's dead, and they're ready to harvest his organs. He's dead for 2.5 hours. And all of the people in the hospital working on him, were witnesses to this. This is a reality that's been recorded. So he's dead, and the parents and the brothers and the fiance are coming to say their goodbyes. And the only reason they have his body kind of going is because he's very valuable in parts, he says. He has a rare blood type AB. And he said, they're just trying to get me to ship my body off to harvest my organs at this point. So he is in the presence of God, and suddenly these people are saying goodbye and wailing, and then he jolts back into his body, and he's full force, physically capable, and he's trying to rip all this stuff, and he desperately at that point on the gurney is trying to get back to the light, just anywhere but here. Just get me back to that light is what's happening to him. And so they end up shipping him to an ICU, and the medical staff everywhere can't figure it out because there's nothing wrong with him. No brain damage, no nothing. It's as though he just walked down the road that day and walked into a hospital and nothing had happened to him. Perfectly healthy. And his mother finds him in the ICU and says, "Rick, are you in there?" And he says, "Yes, Mom, but I died." And so and the thing about his story is that God was so active with one miracle after another. They're like being torpedoed toward him in this story, and so basically he ends up 3 days later having a terrifying experience. So he has his first experience of being in the presence of complete and utter love. And then 3 days later, he had an experience inwardly and in his mind and in his spirit of what would have happened in the initial stages had he died and God not performed this miracle on him. He would have gone straight to hell. And he said, "I do not wish this on my worst enemy, being cut off eternally from all joy and all life, knowing that even though I didn't believe there was a hell, I knew at some level my choices, one after the other, were wrong, even though I rationalized them." And he said, "I put myself in the scariest positions in life, like leaning off a cliff 300 feet up, about to plunge to my death." He said, I've known fear." He said, "but there's nothing that touches the absolute agonizing fear of knowing I've lost God. I've lost all life. I'm going to be in torment moment by moment for an eternity." And he felt that. And one of the reasons God showed him that and brought him back is for him to let people know that hell is real. That we can say that people rationalize it, say, well, a loving God will never send someone there, or it's just a myth, or it can't be that bad, or everyone thinks, well, they're bad, but I'm decent. We put ourselves there. God doesn't send anyone. We put ourselves there, but God has allowed hell to exist, and it's a very important, scary message. It's a wake-up call to humanity. And so he ends up not only having this experience, but God starts to speak to him through scripture in powerful ways, and especially about his mercy, saying, "You were this." And he has a particularly powerful experience in the ICU room where he starts to read scripture, but each passage is literally the Lord speaking to him. And the Lord has a booming voice for him and says in the bathroom in the hospital, "Get on your knees." And he writes, "He who is command, capital C, needs to be obeyed." And basically, the Lord was saying, this is what you've done with your life. I've shown you where that led and what all your decisions have left you with. Now you give your life to me. And he did. And walking out of there, he had the same job, he had the same clothes, he had the same fiance, but everything was different. So he's wandering around, wondering what to do. He ends up in a prayer group where they say, "You're called to go to Medjugorje," which he found was very strange since they didn't really know much about the place. It was a word of knowledge. And there's a whole story of how he gets there. I kind of want to leave some
Yeah,
for other people to find later, but you'll find out how, if you read the book, how he gets called to the priesthood and how he responds to that calling. He actually sees Jesus in Medjugorje, literally face to face.
One question for you. He was friends of Father Lightner, wasn't he?
He
Didn't they go
was,
to
and he
Medjugorje?
still is.
They went to
He still
Medjugorje?
is. They went to Medjugorje together and had a mystical experience in the very Siroki Briesh church that I talked about earlier, where Father Yozo would preach. And they relived what happened, both of them separately, not knowing the other was experiencing it, the martyrdom of the Franciscans in a cave there who died for their faith and the communists killed them.
Right.
So they have an incredible bond. And as you said, in Medjugorje as well, Father Rick Wendell experienced his own personal illumination of conscience. So God showed him all of his past sins up to the very present and the consequences of those sins. And that was another extremely dramatic moment in his life. So that story, is also one of the stories in you asked about the warning prophecies, testimonies and prophecies of the illumination of conscience, the warning. So many stories of people who have had their own personal illumination of conscience are in that. And it's fascinating what he found was a sin that he didn't think was a sin, and then how it changed him.
Let's talk the last gentleman I want to ask you about a little bit here is Deacon David Leatherby. He'd had a tough life, which I'll let you go with and share. Eh, Marriage problems, family work problems, it just kept getting worse and worse. Um, and then he, same thing, got his life turned around and on the right course. Share with us a little bit on Deacon, if you would.
So, yeah, there's a thread through a lot of these stories with Mary working through her apparitions at Medjugorje. And this one in particular, he was raised in a family kind of forced into Catholicism because his dad was a Protestant. His dad had a coworker who was a solid Catholic, evangelizing Catholic. I love evangelizing Catholics, who said, I'll dare you, you read these books. And after you read them and we'll discuss them, I believe that you're going to be Catholic. And he said, dare? And he said, dare. And the two men shook hands. And he had him reading Teresa of Avila and all of the saints. And Deacon's father discovered that there was a depth in Catholicism that he didn't find in Protestantism. There was this depth of faith and experience with God, and that really attracted him. So all of his kids, his 10 kids, become Catholic all of a sudden. They're pulled out of their public schools. They're put in Catholic. And so young Deacon Leatherby hates it. He's like, I'm speaking this foreign language and these really weird rituals. I'm wearing a robe. I don't know what's going on. And that was the mass. Everything was so foreign to him. He ends up marrying. He ends up having his own 4 kids. He's kind of a lukewarm Protestant type Catholic, particularly because his whole life still had his Protestant relatives telling him he was going to hell because his father chose Catholicism. And so he ends up going on a retreat and is very convicted during this retreat. It's called a silent retreat, and that intrigued him because he said, I'm always talking. So he's tortured because he had to shut his mouth. So that was a brutal experience for him at this silent retreat. But finally, it allowed him to hear God's voice and not just his own. So in the silence, he sees this nun and he thinks, she's probably 100 times more holier than I am. She's probably done 100 times more good things than I have. And he contemplates that. And he's like, well, I haven't really given my life to God once, so I've probably only done one good thing. She's probably done 1,000 more good things than I have. And this contemplation of how many good things this nun had done with her life made him just dissolve into tears and try to do better. And that led to him, another evangelizing Catholic, right? He meets at a poolside of his kids' swim meet who just went to Medjugorje and is on fire and says to Leatherby, you've got to go to this place. It's amazing. Conversions are happening, miracles, healings, the heart on fire. And he's thinking, you're nuts, you're nuts, you're nuts. But the man was persistent, and Leatherby, he ran into so many troubles in life. He gave it a shot. His business was failing. His marriage was failing. his wife is unhappy. And so he goes to Medjugorje. Long story short, he comes back on fire and joyful, and really a solid believer, to the point where to this day, if he hears the word Mary, he cries.
Hmm.
And if he's in Mass, he cries. And his kids became very fervent Catholics, in part because at Mass, whenever her name was brought up, or whenever the consecration happened, he'd start to tear. So all the kids would want to look over at Dad when they heard the name Mother Mary, to see what would happen. And sure enough, the leakage would happen. And so he comes back from Medjugorje very happy. Meanwhile, his wife is disgusted with him. They have business trouble. They're getting sued. Everything's going wrong. And she says, I don't want to be with you anymore. This is no fun. I hate this and I hate you. So he ends up living in the slums because he's no longer got any money because his business. He no longer has got his wife. It's hard for him to see his kids. He's miserable. He works his way back up just by grit into a job that makes him money, and wiggles his way back into his wife's life. She still doesn't want anything to do with him, but she ends up working at, they own an ice cream chain, and his wife works there, and he gets a prayerful message from a man who received a word of knowledge. And the man says, I've got to meet you. I've got to give you this word of knowledge. You need to hear this. And Leatherby says, what, Curtis? I'm busy. There's lots of stuff going on. What? And he goes, I've got to meet you. You got to hear this. And he meets the man, and the message is, tell your wife that you love her. He's like, I've done that. The woman hates me. That's not going to work. But he thinks, well, this sounds like the Blessed Mother to me. So he goes over and he says, she's behind the counter at their store, and says, can I speak with you? No, I'm busy. I don't want to talk to you anyway. Can I speak with you? What? Can I speak with you? Okay. Okay. So they walk outside, and he says something to the effect of, you're the only woman for me. I've always loved you. Everything I have is yours. I'm committed to you for life. You mean the world to me. And he said that she gave him the iciest, cold, hate-filled stare in return. And that was it. And he walked off, and he looked at the sunset. He said, Mary, why did you have me do that again? You know the result. What was that? Little did he know that her words had poured hot coals on top of her that began to burn. And what happened was all these terrible misfortunes started to happen to his wife after that. She got a terrible burn in her eye. Her new car that was a status symbol, so she could drive up to school and pick up the kids in a new big Suburban. That's funny. I don't know. It's just not the way I think. Somehow that status symbol was a great thing, was stolen out of their driveway. They had no insurance on it. She's at the store. She's held up by gunpoint. She's traumatized. The money's stolen. And then she says, I just want to die. I just want to die. And so Leatherby, he goes to church one day. He says, I go to Medjugorje, I'm full of joy and I'm trying, but everything's going wrong, Lord. Like everything. My wife doesn't, want to live anymore. Where are the graces? I don't get it. And this woman appears whom he's never seen before. Suddenly she's at his side and says to him, those misfortunes that you're talking about, those are answers to your prayer. And then she disappears. He still doesn't get it. And so his wife, through all this suffering, it ends up, it's Lent, and he's always trying to, she's allowed him back in the home, but really doesn't like him. And he's putting holy books on the kids' beds, and he's signing them with the sign of the cross at night. And she's always taking away the religious objects in the house because she finds them socially embarrassing, Yeah. So, he's in a hostile situation at home, and he's saying to the kids at dinner, "So it's Lent. What are you going to give up? What are you going to do?" And the kids are saying chocolate, this and that. And the wife says, "You haven't asked me what I'm going to do." He says, "Oh." And she noticed that he'd been going to daily mass and that he was always joyful, and that really ticked her off. And she said, "I'm going to go to daily mass because no matter how much I hate you, you're always joyful." So I'm going to go to daily mass. So she goes to daily mass. That starts her conversion. And then she ends up going to confession, and that converts her even more. And then she slowly softens to him. And he, in turn, begins to see her differently as someone he's really hurt. Because before, she was just mean instead of someone he'd hurt. And so they both started to work together. And, it's just an amazing story of reconciliation and perseverance, because I forgot to add that moment that Curtis came with the note saying, "Tell your wife you love her," he had started to file the papers for divorce and he did it out of love, or so he thought, because that's what she wanted. So he's like, "I just got to grant her wish. If she doesn't want me around, I just have to do this." And so through thick and thin, Mary's intercession and God's grace and mercy saved their marriage. And she ends up going to Medjugorje. The kids end up going to Medjugorje. They lead pilgrimages there, and so the fruits continue.
What struck me was he's trying to walk the walk, and you never know how people can learn from your way of life by trying to be Christ-like, by being loving and kind. That helped convert her. And it's a beautiful thing to remember, I think, for all of us, that people see in Christians who are really full of God's love, like Jesus behind me, they do have those rays of mercy coming out from their heart. You radiate the love of the Blessed Mother. That's like your life's mission, is to share that love of the Blessed Mother.
Mm.
Christine, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today for Mercy Unbound.
Thank you so much.
And just keep up the good work. I look forward to getting your book on the miraculous medal. We talked before the show. That's near and dear to my heart. And our faith is so rich, as you said, the depth of the faith. And we're here just a short time. We're fleeting on this earth. And just keep up the good work and spreading the love of the Blessed Mother for us and the mercy of God. And I will have you back for sure on Mercy Unbound. And so people, I hope you enjoyed this show. Get the books. Christine, one question I have is, what would be the best way to get your books? Would it be on your website or
Either way, whatever people prefer. You can go to queenofpeacemedia.com. They're all there, or just search them up on amazon.com.
Okay. Well, people, again, I hope you enjoyed the show. Subscribe and share, and we'll just look forward to seeing you or have you listen to the next show of Mercy Unbound. God bless all of you, and let's spread the truth, because the truth will set us free. And Christine, thank you again. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/Dr. Brian, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbryanThatcher.com.